What is the method that the rabbis are demonstrating for us? What's the message for those who come later about how to respond to an enormous disruption or the aspects of the tradition that aren't working? So that's always our meta question. It's always my meta
Right,
question.
right. And I guess I just also want to note for people that are watching this for the first time that this show or whatever this is meant to be accessible to people who don't know a lot about Talmud. We're trying, and we'd love to get feedback if it's not accessible. But it's meant to be. We want it to be accessible to someone who really knows very little, if maybe nothing, about the Talmud, and also, though, hopefully interesting to people who do know quite a bit. If you're a professor of Talmud, I hope it'll also be interesting to you. But if not, we're willing to sacrifice that audience. The I would say, B'nai is a professional Talmud teacher. I'm not. I'm more of a fan. And I'm also very interested in the Torah. And we talked last week about this idea that I believe that the story of the Talmud that you tell, B'nai, uh, which is the Talmud as this record of how to recover from a crash, how to rebuild Judaism when the previous version falls apart. I very much feel like that's also the story that the Torah is telling, in particular in the book of Exodus and Numbers,
Mhm.
and also Leviticus. I'm starting to get a better feel for Leviticus than I used to. So I think that there's this rhyming, and actually it would make sense that there's this rhyming because it's the same every time. And I'm reminded of a way that Professor Leon Kass, put it in his book on Genesis. In the introduction, he says, the question, something like, I'm paraphrasing, but something like, it's not a question of whether or not these stories actually happened. The point is that this is the way it always happens. Meaning that mythology, wisdom, is saying that there are certain things that are just always the case. And the way that we pass that wisdom along from generation to generation is through storytelling. And that's because people learn best through stories. And you can also read it in nonfiction. You can also have it laid out, but it doesn't quite have the same, I think, educational impact as internalizing these stories. And I've been concerned lately, as we've seen the Jewish community grappling with the COVID-19 situation and the crash of the crash of the world, the crash of Judaism, so many things crashing, that there isn't as much talk as I would have expected, wanted, hoped for, that is saying, hey, guys, we know what to do. Our tradition
Yeah.
tells us what to do now. Like, you want to read it in the Torah, you want to read it in the Talmud, but we know what to do. And it's depressing to me a little bit that I'm not hearing that story, because it feels to me that it means that maybe we have done a lousy job of education about what Judaism really is. Because if people aren't seeing it as the toolbox that we have to deal with this situation, including the crash of Judaism itself,
Yeah.
then we got to step up our game. You've been doing a great job for many, many years. I think we have to amplify your voice on that, and that's what we're trying to do here.
Yeah. As we talked about last week, there's this sense when there isn't utter physical destruction, and I'm not hoping that there is, but in the absence of utter physical destruction, there is the challenge of having a system that looks like it's working, even though nobody's going to it, or very few people are really excited in using it. That we have to preserve and hold on to it, because oh my God, what if we get it wrong? What if we lose this? And I'm reminded of actually my very first Talmud teacher, Danny Gordis, saying to me once when I came to him with my anxiety about, what if I mess with the tradition the way I'm thinking about, and what if I get it wrong? This is before I even knew the Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai deathbed story. And he said to me, B'nai, you're not that powerful and you're not that smart. And I found that very liberating, because I thought, okay, well, if I don't have to worry about being responsible for ruining this thing, then I'm going to roll up my sleeves and be bold. But I think we're feeling what some portion of every community in a crash feels, which is batten down the hatches, preserve what you can, put all your energy toward making sure those parts of our tradition that are falling apart don't fall apart. And as you've always talked about, we should do some of that, but we should also have sort of the venture capital approach as well. But I want to also get back to what you were saying about Torah being a story about crashes. And even though I'm not a Torah person so much, in that I'm not an expert on Torah, I'm not an expert on Talmud either. But
But
we
you're
have,
literally playing one on TV, so it's
yeah,
okay.
exactly. That we have this notion that the rabbis believe that the Torah was the word of God. I don't believe that for a minute. And I'm happy to debate that. And, I'm happy to be disagreeing with scholars, but we have a pietistic relationship to the Torah that I think the rabbis never did. They understood that it was a retelling of a prior crash. That we now have sort of solidified, and we make the Torah sort of this original story that I think they never believed that it was. And I think you're absolutely right that the Torah itself encompasses the mechanics of retelling.
Well, so I think today we're going to explore some of that in the text that we want to look at today, which is one of my favorites. To me, it's fundamental.
Yeah.
And there are a number of fundamental texts, including the one that we did last week, and including the one that I think we're going to do next week, which is called the Oven of Achnai. It's one of the most famous texts, let's say, in like liberal Judaism. It sort of stands for some of the principles that liberal Judaism tends to be about. And so it's beloved, in among a lot of, Reform rabbis, conservative rabbis, whatever. But this text that we're going to do today, I think I always teach it as whenever I teach the text for next week, Tanur Shel Achnai, the Oven of Achnai, I always teach this text first. Because I think that a lot of the ideas in Tanur Shel Achnai are better understood in light of the text that we're going to do today,
Yeah.
which is just to set the scene. So I want to say a couple of things. One, just to mention again that there is a source sheet on Sefaria, and Sefaria is a website that gives you access to all traditional Jewish texts. And there's a function there called the source sheet where people like us can make a collection of certain texts and make it accessible to people. So if you're watching this on Facebook Live, if you're watching this later on the jewishLIVE website, if you're watching it currently on the jewishLIVE website, there are links to that Sefaria source sheet on all those places. So you can just click on that link and it'll take you there. And the way that we've arrayed those texts is that they're by episode. So so we're just adding to it every week. So it's never a different link. It's the same link every week. And you can just scroll down and see the text for this week. And hopefully that'll be a valuable resource down the road as well. So we're going to share the screen every once in a while here. We were just talking earlier that we want this to ultimately work as a podcast as well. So we're going to try to make it so that if you're listening, you're getting just about as much information as if you're actually able to see us or to see the text. But and apologies if we miss the boat on that. But I want to share the text here. So it's a text that comes from the Talmud tractate that officially is about Shabbat. It's called Shabbat. And it comes from page 88a or 88 Aleph, and which basically means the first side of the page. The pages in the Talmud are numbered based on the folio, meaning both sides of the page are called 88, and so we call them 88a and 88b, or 88 Aleph and 88 Bet. So this is from 88 side A. And it is a text. It really, doesn't have much directly to do with Shabbat. It just happens to be in the book called Shabbat. The Talmud is full of all kinds of meanderings from one topic to another that you could probably explain how they ended up there. But in any event, it's not really important for today. What this story is, last week we, in a way, saw a story about the origins of rabbinic Judaism, the very beginnings. I mean, it wasn't really, there were things that happened before, as we talked about, but it's sort of an origin story of how did rabbinic Judaism get started as Second Temple Judaism was ending. And in many ways, this is a story that rhymes with that, because this is a story of how biblical Judaism started at Mount Sinai, right, with the giving of the Torah. And there's quite a few stories in the Talmud that we will explore on this show that are sort of situated at Mount Sinai, and that interesting things happen there beyond what the Torah says. And famously, the rabbis talked about there being both an oral Torah, written Torah, what we know as the Torah, and the oral Torah, which they then put into written form called the Talmud, and that was their story. And
And they were sticking with it.
they were sticking with it, and we will definitely explore that on many levels. But there's a lot of scenes in the Talmud that are situated at Sinai, and it's not necessarily a question of the oral Torah or the written Torah. It's just that that's an important scene for them, just as the scene of the early days of Yavna is an important scene for us today. And so I think it's not an accident that they are exploring that scene a lot. And so today, we'll set the scene here. This is a story about the very beginnings of the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. If we look at the way that that scene is depicted in the Torah, in the book of Exodus, it is an extremely dramatic scene. There's thunder and lightning and sounds and visions, and the people ultimately are so afraid of all of this that they ultimately ask God to please stop talking. It's too intense for us to hear God talking. Please just tell Moses and he'll tell us. That's the level of intensity that the Torah depicts in this scene. And I think it's important because we'll show why it's important to just understand that it's not only what the Talmud's about to say, it's that the way the Torah depicts this scene, it's very, very intense.
And one thing I want to add, and I hope I'm not giving away too much, but I want to amplify what you said about this being an important moment. The Sinai moment is important on many levels. Number one, we all know that's when we receive the Torah. Okay, it's important for that reason. But it's also important because it's the moment we sort of sign on to the deal between us and God. This is the covenant moment. This is the moment of God's revelation, the beginning of a real relationship with God, and it determines how we see ourselves in relation to God, our relation to the tradition, our relation to Torah, the deal we made with God, and this sort of commitment that every Jew who is ever born or becomes part of the Jewish people in any way sees as their origin story. So you're born into this moment, whether you were actually there or not. It's as if you were there and you were part of the deal that happened. Okay, so I just want to say that.
Okay, great. So I'm just going to share this screen here in a moment, just for the sake of being able, for those who are watching, to see where we are. And again, if you're not watching, you're just listening, don't worry, because we're going to read it all out loud. So here is here's the source sheet from Sefaria, and let me just start to read, and B'nai, feel free to interrupt me if you have something to say, in the middle, and I'll also stop reading when I do. So,
okay.
So the beginning is, it says, the Torah says, and by the way, I should just say, for those who are looking at this, the things that are in bold are actually what's a direct translation of the words of the Talmud. And of course, there's never anything that's exactly a translation, so there's a little bit of interpretive license potentially. And the things that are in not bold are either they're put by Adin Steinsaltz, who's a famous translator and explainer of the Talmud, or sometimes I or potentially B'nai have made some changes or some additions to the translation to better capture what we're trying to do here. So the text as we have it says, the Torah says, and Moses brought forth the people out of the camp to meet God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. That's from the book of Exodus, chapter 19. And that's the usual translation, or the translation that you'll see in most, if not all, translations in a Torah, is it says they stood at the foot of the mountain. So a rabbi named Rabbi Avdimi Bar Chama Bar Chasa said, the Jewish people actually stood beneath the mountain. And I'm explaining here that the Hebrew word betachtit, which most translations translate as at the foot of, actually comes from the root tachat, or under. So it seems obvious that of course it means they stood at the foot of the mountain, right? But technically you could translate it as they stood under the mountain. And the Talmud here, Rav Avdimi Bar Chama Bar Chasa, is choosing to translate it that way and to say that, but betachtit means under. Yeah, B'nai.
Let's not forget that if you know Yiddish, your underside is your tuchus, right?
Right.
Okay, so that's your
Right.
tachat.
And tuchus comes from the same root as tachat.
Tachat,
A lot of times in Yiddish or in an
right.
Ashkenazi pronunciation of Hebrew, what we pronounce today often as T is pronounced as S. And so tachat and tuchus is the same word. And so
Exactly.
your tachat is your underside or your butt. And so that's the root of this word. And so they're saying, it's not at the foot of, it's actually under. Let's not take the easy way out here. They stood under the mountain. So what does that mean that they stood under the mountain? So Rabbi Avdimi Bar Chama Bar Chasa continues. He says, and that means the verse teaches that the Holy Blessed One overturned the mountain above the Jews like a tub or a barrel. We could translate in different ways, but B'nai and I've had long conversations about what it was exactly and why it matters. I think we don't want to have that conversation now, but God picked up the mountain, turned it upside down, and held it over the people. And God said, if you accept the Torah, very well. And if not, there will be your burial place, right? Meaning that I'm going to drop it on you. If you don't accept the Torah, I'm going to drop this mountain on you. Now, the reason I wanted to set the scene earlier and say that the Torah itself depicts this incredibly intense, scary scene with lightning and thunder and the loud voice of God that the people are so afraid of, is that this is a nice kind of this is a colorful image that God actually picks up the mountain and holds it over them. But this isn't Rabbi Avdimi Bar Chama Bar Chasa making this up. This is a colorful way of describing exactly the scene that the Torah describes, which is a scene of great power and threat. So it's like, do you need the mafia boss to hold a gun to your head literally and to say, if you don't give me the money, I'm going to shoot you? Or is it obvious that if the big scary mafia boss comes and says, give me the money, that the implication is, or I'm going to harm you? Right, and so here he's making literal what Rav Avdimi Bar Chama Bar Chasa is making literal what the Torah basically is telling us, which is there's a great power imbalance going on here. An incredibly powerful, intense God on the one hand telling you, oh, here's my offer to you. You guys want to do this, have this Torah, and like, what are you going to say no?
But I want to point out that I'm not sure that power imbalance is the only message that the Torah is giving us about what it was like. The Torah also portrays us as being, very anxious and enthusiastic about accepting the Torah and meeting God. And, the whole Na'aseh v'nishma,
Right.
we're portrayed as the people who were ready to accept the Torah. We don't care what it says. Give it to us. We'll take it. Whatever it calls upon us to do, we'll do. And, there are multiple stories interpreting that moment of us receiving the Torah with, us being so every other people refuse the Torah. What's in it? Oh, do not kill. Oh no, we're down. We really love killing. We don't want the Torah. What else is it? And we said, no, we'll take it. We don't care what's in it. We want it. We want it. So there's a way that I think you may be re-emphasizing or reading back into the story and lifting up that coercive element, which is not the story we tell about ourselves biblically, I think.
Right. I mean, I agree with you. And I would also say, I would sort of challenge our watchers, our listeners, to go and actually read the story, because I think that there are two layers here, right? One is, what does the story actually say? And the other is like, what has the traditional, or what we perceive to be the traditional way of understanding that story been? And it's clear that that what you just said is absolutely true of the way that we have been taught that story.
Right.
But the way that we talked about last week too, that we've been taught the story of the founding of Yavne, that Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai founded Yavne. But if you actually read the story, it's pretty clear that he did not found Yavne. And similarly, I think that a lot of those ideas that, well, we were so excited to receive the Torah, are not really all that well borne out by the story that the Torah itself tells. They certainly are the way that we have been
Mhm.
taught that story. And so many times those of us, this is why I've also said that a lot of times those of us who have a really good Jewish education are in the worst position. I mean, good Jewish education meaning
Yeah.
what's perceived to be a good Jewish education. We're in the worst position to do some of this
Mhm.
interpretive work because we have been so colored by the way that we have
Mhm.
learned the story that we almost can't read it the way that it's written. And so somebody coming to the story new and fresh, and we've talked a lot about the importance of early rabbis who didn't come from a Jewish background, that they're so important because they're actually just reading it and saying, wait a second, everything that you're saying here, it's not actually in the story. So
Yeah.
tell me where are you getting this business that, God went around and offered the Torah to everybody and only the Jews accepted it? It's like, oh, I remember when my son was in a Jewish day school and he would come home with these stories of, about how heroic Abraham was and everyone. And I would say, well, where that story come from? He says, well, it's in the Torah. And I said, it's not in the
Yeah.
Torah,
Yeah.
but he had been taught that it was in the Torah. Anyway, so, I'm not sure what's actually in the Torah and what's not, meaning we should look and debate and discuss,
Yeah.
but
I want to throw in another layer, which I learned from Barry Wimpheimer, and he brings out the fact that this very midrash, the idea that tachtit, under, that they stood under the mountain, actually means that they literally stood under it, that God held the mountain over their heads and said, accept the Torah and everything will be fine. And if you don't, this will be your burial place. That this very midrash is a complete retelling of the exact midrash that appeared several hundred years earlier in a collection called the Mechilta, a Tannaitic source, a source from about 200-300 years before, which says that God held the mountain up before the Jews arrived, and they walked voluntarily under it to
hmm,
show their enthusiasm and commitment to Torah. The
hmm,
very same author of the midrash, that was the original midrash.
hmm.
And so this is now a kind of reworking that you're saying is actually in line with the biblical story itself,
Right.
and not the reworking that we all accept as what the biblical moment was.
Right, and one of the themes that I would hope that folks, participating in this start to do is to really kind of try to track those movements of these stories that get interpreted and reinterpreted back to the way they were, and again and again, and
Mm-hmm.
that's fine.
Mm-hmm.
That I'm not sort of suggesting that somebody was doing anything wrong. I think that that's how culture it works and evolves, but it also potentially frees us to do what we need
Yeah.
to do in our time, right? So
That's right.
so
It's
so
it's
yeah, go ahead.
definitely it's definitely a playing with our central mythic moment.
Right.
And as you say, you can decide which was the original myth and which was the reworking. And if maybe we have several layers of reworking here, and maybe the ultimate meta message, although we're not done even, is you can rework your myths.
Right. So let's go on.
Okay.
So that's the scene, right? So the mountain is literally being held over their heads, but again, I wanna focus people who think like, well, that's obviously just a story that this rabbi made up or that was from the Mechilta and they reworked. Okay, but still, even just read the scene that the Torah itself portrays, and it's a scene that basically is a power imbalance, where do the Jews really have an opportunity to say no? That seems not really. That's what's being portrayed here, and this is being portrayed in a colorful way, but I think
Mm-hmm.
so does the Torah. So Rav Avdimi Bar Chama Bar Chasa goes on and he says that basically what that means, or sorry, Rav Avdimi Bar Chama Bar Chasa gives a story, and then another rabbi, Rav Acha Bar Yaakov, comes in and says, from here, there is a substantial protest to the binding authority of the Torah. Okay,
Okay. Now
so
we have to sit back and digest this.
right, right. So here's where I feel like I have a little bit of a leg to stand on as a former contract law professor, which
Exactly.
I did in my previous career. And I always taught, contracts in the first few days of law school. And, we talked about last week how really what the Talmud's agenda is to teach you how to think in a certain way. And this is an amazing example of that. And there are some basic principles of contract law in American contract law and in every contract law, which include the principle that a contract has to be, in order for a contract to be binding, the contract has to be voluntary on the part of both parties. And there are other elements as well. They have to each be receiving a benefit from the contract. But even if both are receiving a benefit from the contract and it wasn't voluntary, then the contract is, generally speaking, not binding. And so what Rav Acha Bar Yaakov is saying here when he says, so if this is true, right? If the Torah, if the mountain was being held over their heads and God said basically, if you don't accept it, I'm going to kill you, literally, then the contract is not binding. So because it is a contract under duress, that's the legal terminology. A contract made under duress is not a binding contract. And if this contract is made under duress, then it's not binding. Now, we in Judaism tend to call a contract by another name, a covenant. And if the covenant was made under duress, even with God, even in this sort of sacred, you could say, oh, well, there's an exception when it's God, etc. But Rav Acha Bar Yaakov doesn't say that exception. Right? He's saying, no, if it's under duress, then it's not binding. That's just basic principles.
Yeah. And I want to bring in Barry Windheimer again, because he says really beautifully that what the rabbis are doing here is they're shifting a theological moment into a legal moment. They're taking a relational God experience and they're turning it into straight up a contract law.
Uh-huh.
And I think that's really interesting. And not only do they do that, they then find it faulty, as everyone who knows law does. And as soon that the Talmud knows that that everyone who's reading this text and hears Rabbi Avdimi Bar Chama Bar Chassa's original midrash, as soon as they hear that, they immediately go to contract under duress. So the covenant is no good. Jewish law is not binding. And Rashi clarifies what we know even before we get to this objection, hey, that's duress, that at any point in the future from that moment, if anyone is called to judgment, hey, you didn't follow the law. If God ever says to you, hey, you didn't do this, you didn't do that, they'll have a defense. They'll say,
right,
the halacha wasn't binding on me in the first place. This whole covenant, this whole system was never binding on me. So
right,
I'm okay.
Right.
That's enormous. I mean, that's
enormous.
Enormous.
And I know that I keep saying this, but I really want to stress it for those who say, but that's just a midrash, that's just a story, is that there's another principle in contract law, which is that, if it's directly duress, right, you say, I'm going to kill you if you do it, then it's not binding. But there's basically an equally substantial principles in contract law, including ancient contract law, that when there's a severe power imbalance between the parties and the duress was not explicit, that nevertheless there is grounds to undo the contract. And so even if you read, so what I'm saying is that Rav Avdimi Bar Chama Bar Chassa is orienting us with a sort of extreme version to say that this is a contract under, if this is a contract under duress, then it's not binding. But now let's actually read the Torah story, and what we see here is a contract between two vastly unequal parties, which is probably under the same principles, also not binding. So even if you don't buy Rav Avdimi Bar Chama Bar Chassa's story, it's still pretty much the same principle.
And I want to sit back at this point and ask myself, okay, why would the rabbis be invested in retelling our covenant moment in such a way that undoes the obligation to follow Jewish law and to follow what they understood to be God's will? And for me, if you're going to be radically playing with the tradition and reworking it in ways that might have been unrecognizable to someone who actually received it at Mount Sinai, you might be invested in resetting that new system on a foundation which didn't imply that you were obligated to some other system.
Right.
That maybe the reason they were undoing the original covenant was to give them a little breathing room, a little space, that they're kind of retrojecting back into God's mind, saying, God actually gave us permission to play because God knew that this was a contract under duress. God never could have held us responsible and gave us this room to play. It's just
right. No,
Just a
I
possibility.
totally agree with that, and this is going to come back around in our conversation, I think, a number of times. But I a point hit me recently that I think is really important to underscore, which is that at the time that the Talmud was, certainly at the time that these early stories were composed, but even at the time of the redaction of the Talmud, the final editing of the Talmud in 6th, 7th century, around there, uh, most Jews could not read, or certainly could not read in a very sophisticated way. So not too many Jews could read the Talmud at all. By the way, that was true for all of Jewish history until probably the last few decades even. Not only was the Talmud translated into vernacular languages, but also with the advent of Sefaria and the internet, that now people can access it all very quickly.
And Svara, let's say.
And Svara in terms of new ways of teaching people and of encouraging people to study. So there's so many
Sorry for
things
the plug.
happening. No, I agree with that. Sorry. I tend to focus on technology. I appreciate the focus on people. So my point is that very few people could read this. But everybody who could read it, everybody who could read at all, this may be a bit of an overstatement, but not a ton of an overstatement. Everybody who could read in a sophisticated enough way to read the Talmud, which is hard to read even today for people who are knowledgeable. It's a difficult slog. If you could read it, then you would understand it in a sophisticated way. So essentially, what's going on here? But by the way, this was not meant for the people, right? So the idea was that your average people were not reading this. Who was reading this was other rabbis, and so what's going on here has to be understood as a conversation among an elite, among the rabbis, saying, here's what's really going on here. Now, what you end up telling the people, that might be something very different. It's not the Talmud here is not saying, hey, this is a sermon that you should all be giving in the synagogue. The rabbis weren't in synagogues in those days, whatever. That's a whole nother story. But so I think it's important to understand that within this particular group of rabbis, they were trying, why were they doing what you were asking, right? Why were they trying to establish this non-binding nature of the Torah? And probably, right, like we're talking about the creative class during this period of crash, right, during this period of rebuilding. And they were saying, at least among us creators here, we have a little more license than maybe you were educated to think that we did before you came to rabbinical school. I think sometimes we think of in our time that going to rabbinical school is about sort of telling people what the rules are. At least in that, I don't think that's true today, or it shouldn't be true today. But back then, it seems like going to rabbinical school was like, let's tell you how it's really working back here.
Yeah, and what I want to point out is the tragedy of modernity is that the Talmud is no longer taught in that way. The obvious moves toward radical reinvention of the tradition have been misread and misunderstood as a kind of pietism toward the biblical text, where winks were meant to use the text in a playful way. They've been missed, so that the Talmud is now read, with the exception of Svara, in many yeshivot as a conservative document, not a radical document, and is not taught to the creative class. It's taught to the conserving class.
Right.
And I think these reads are being lost. I think you're right that they were obvious originally, into the original readers, not only the creators of it, but the original readers of it. But the Talmud has done too good a job
Right.
at camouflaging, just as all law does. But lawyers stay creative because their teachers teach them, how to make the winks and the sleight of hands.
Sometimes they do. They do.
Yeah. Okay.
I think these are phenomena that are actually true across legal systems, across cultural systems. And it's something to think about. If we're at a creative moment today in Jewish history, then we may want to think about how to follow some of the examples that the Talmud and the Torah give us, but we may also want to think about how to not make some of the same mistakes, because it may be that it's almost inevitable. Maybe the mistakes are inevitable, because there's just no way to provide a system like this, and to make it kind of impossible to screw it up in the future. But it's a natural thing, especially when you put something in a text,
Yep.
that a conservative class will take it, and they'll take it in a very conservative, in a way where, that instead of the text liberating our thought, which I think is what they were trying to do here, the text actually, and this is just the nature of text, that it has the capacity to anchor thought and to unliberate it and to bind
Yep.
it, right? And even if it was unintentional. And so how do we solve that? I'm not sure. I hope it's something that we'll continue to talk about. In the interest of time, I think we should move on, just because we
Yep.
want to make sure that we complete this text in this episode. Hopefully, we can always pick it up a little
Yes,
bit next time.
definitely.
But having set the scene that everybody who could read this kind of understood what was going on here, let's go on, because I think what happens next is really quite interesting as well.
Okay,
So
so before we jump into the text, just to recap, we now have a covenant that's been undone.
right,
It's been broken. The rabbis have established with this midrash and the clarification of the implications of the midrash that what happened at Mount Sinai was the Torah was received under duress, and therefore the Torah is not binding on us.
right,
We're
right,
freed from it.
right.
Okay,
So
great.
we continue.
Okay.
So we now have Rav Acha Bar Yaakov explaining that if this story is actually true, then the Torah is not binding. And now Rava steps in. Now I think it's important to note about Rava that Rava in Aramaic, it's not somebody's name. If there's an aleph at the end of a word in Aramaic, often it's the same as a hey at the beginning of the word in Hebrew, and it means the. And Rav means rabbi. So Rava means the rabbi, meaning this man is so important that he doesn't even need a name. He is the rabbi. The rabbi said, right? And it's sort of like people who call the Lubavitcher Rebbe, called him the Rebbe, the Rebbe of Chabad. You don't need to say which Rebbe, the Rebbe, you know which one that is. And this Rava was so important that he is known in the Talmud as the rabbi, and arguably he is the hero of the Talmud. He is the most important rabbi in the Talmud, relatively late rabbi, and or sort of middle time period of the Talmud, and kind of a really very, very significant figure that we'll explore many times over the course of this session. But just keep in mind, there's a very important rabbi steps in and says,
And I'll point out that he is sort of the rabbi saint of Svara. He's our hero because he was the guy who expanded the notion of Svara, of moral intuition, which we use as the driving engine for all innovation. Okay, I'll just leave it there.
And I think it's valuable to note that he's usually on the liberal side in our terminology, right? That meaning, like,
Absolutely.
if Rava's saying something that seems conservative, maybe it's not.
Yeah.
That's another thing to point out. So here Rava steps in and he says, okay, Rav Acha Bar Yaakov, you're right. If well, let's not actually say Rava does not question the story. Right. Rava basically seems to be accepting that this actually happened. This duress happened. And if the duress happened, Rav Acha Bar Yaakov is right, that therefore the Torah is not binding. And Rava says, even so, even though it's not binding, they again accepted it willingly in the time of Achashverosh, which means in the Purim story, as it is written in the Megillah, in the book of Esther. The Jews ordained and took upon themselves. In Hebrew, that's kiyamu v'kiblu. They ordained and took upon themselves, and upon their seed, and upon all such as joined themselves unto them. This is from Esther chapter 9, verse 27. And Rava taught, that what that means when they said the Jews ordained and took upon themselves is that the Jews ordained what they had already taken upon themselves at Sinai, meaning that it's what is called in contract law, also in American contract law and in general in all contract systems, the term is ratification, meaning that if there is a contract that was not binding, but at some later time when we do have equal power, when there's no more duress, and I voluntarily, and other terms of the contract are met, such as that both parties did receive a benefit, or what's called in contract law consideration, then the person who was under duress can come back later and say, yes, I was under duress when I made the contract, but I now want that contract and I'm now not under duress. And so I want to say that the contract that I made when I was under duress is now binding, and that is called a ratification. And all contract systems say a ratification is kosher. If a contract is ratified, then now it is binding. And so what Rava is basically saying is, you're right, it wasn't binding back then. Now it's binding. If
1,000 years later, let's just point
yeah,
out.
right. No, so I'm thinking like the Torah is given probably, I mean, grossly, in the year 1200 BCE. The Esther story takes place, I don't know, sometime around, let's say, 500 BCE or something like that. So, in the realm of 700 years later, 1,000 years later, whatever, it's binding. So I feel bad for the Jews who lived, I guess 700 years or 1,000 years with all these laws that turned out they thought, they thought they had to do these things or they were going to be punished. And it turned out it was a completely not binding. They could have done whatever they want. Like, I feel
right. Well, it turned out that they did. I mean, it turned out that the rabbis actually messed with it for 1,000 years. And it was like, great. We had a lot of freedom to do that. We had a, carte blanche to do whatever we wanted. Now that we're kind of done, now we'll say it's binding again. Right. Okay, now let's look. First of all, let's point out the rather ridiculous midrash that Rava is using, which had to be obvious to everyone around him. Well, to establish his ratification. Go ahead.
So let's do that, and so then we can have a conversation for the rest of the time. So let's go on, because we don't hide the ball here, and so we are giving you on the source sheet the source from the Book of Esther that is being cited here. And by the way, I would strongly encourage you, that whenever you read a source cited in the Talmud, a Torah source, that you should go back and read the original source, and you'll find some very interesting things there, which including that it often does not actually say what they say it says. And we're going to encounter that again next week when we study the story of the Evan of Achnai. But so going to the source in the Book of Esther, chapter 9, let's read it in context, because does come from the words cited come from verse 27, but we're going to read 26 to 28 so that we get the context. And so this is at the end of the whole Esther story, where the Queen Esther saves the Jews and etc. And everybody's happy. And they say, and for that reason that this all worked out, these days were named Purim, after Pur, which means a lottery. In view then of all the instructions in the said letter, telling people what to do, that Mordechai and Esther sent, and of what they had experienced in the matter and what had befallen them, the Jews ordained and took upon themselves, there's the quote, and upon their seed and upon all that joined unto them, to observe these 2 days in the manner prescribed at the proper time each year. Consequently, these days are recalled and observed in every generation, by every family, every province, and every city. And these days of Purim shall never cease among the Jews, and the memory of them shall never perish among their descendants. So the point to be made here is that when Rava, again, remind you, the greatest rabbi in the history of the Talmud, said, but there was a ratification because the Jews ordained and took upon themselves, and in the days of Achashverosh in the Purim story, and you actually read the source, what they ordained and took upon themselves was Purim. They ordained and took upon themselves that we're going to celebrate Purim every year. It doesn't say anything there about that they ordained and took upon themselves the whole Torah. Now, you could come up with some very strange interpretation to say, like, how by observing Purim, somehow they also, right? But it's very much of a stretch, and there's an equally plausible interpretation that this is a quote taken out of context.
Right. And let's also remember that I don't think the rabbis were really under any impression that the Purim story ever happened. Okay, so if the Purim story never happened, and they knew it never happened, to root the reestablishment, the ratification of the covenant and the bindingness of Torah upon us in a story that never happened is like saying, okay, Torah was never binding on us from Mount Sinai, but it was because in the Flintstones, or because in the Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, when this dwarf said to that dwarf, that's why it's binding. I mean, it's just laughable.
Then they don't even quote. But then it's a misquotation from the Flintstones.
A misquotation, right? Of the dwarfs. But it's both a ratification and a re-undoing.
Right.
It's saying, okay, everything's nice. We're tying it up. And by the way, I hope it's obvious to you that it's still wide open.
Right. And again, like, I want to point out, that's why I want to point out to people that everybody who could read at this time knew this, because everybody who could read knew or could quickly check the Purim Megillah and to see, what the context was here. And there weren't your casual readers who are picking this up and going, oh, interesting, walking away like a lot of people might today, because they can read the Talmud quote, but they don't necessarily know the Torah so well that they realize that there's a misquote here or whatever. So, at that time, everybody who could read this knew this. Is what I want to sort of put out there as more than a hypothesis, as a premise. So nothing is being hidden here from people at that time. Right? It's maybe we have learned it in a way that is hidden because we're not teaching it the way that they taught it back then. But none of this is hidden. So if you're a rabbi hanging out in rabbinical school at this time, what you have just learned, if you study this text, is that the Torah is not binding, not necessarily because it was held over our heads, but because of the actual scene depicted in the Torah of the fear and everything. So the Torah is not binding. But we're going to say that it's binding based on this misquotation of a story that probably never happened. So the implication is, guys, it's really not binding, right?
Right.
Right. That's what you're picking up in rabbinical school in the 7th century. And
Right.
the question is, what are they doing?
Yeah.
So what are they doing?
Well, for me, it's a giant declaration that we are in charge of what the content of our tradition is. And I want to bring Yitz in here because Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, also one of my teachers, has a beautiful understanding of this story, which is that after the destruction of the Second Temple, the rabbis knew that miracles weren't going to happen anymore. Actually, it's not that they didn't think miracles were going to happen. They just decided they were no longer going to heed miracles. And we're going to get to this in our story next week. But they lived in a world where God hadn't stepped in to save the temple. And they knew that was going to be the reality in the future. They were not going to, they were no longer going to understand themselves as living in a world where miracles were going to save them. And they realized that their contract was with a God who was this overpowering, overawing, miracle making God. And if we were going to live in a world where God wasn't going to do that, we were going to need to redo a covenant with a God who wasn't going to do that anymore. And Yitz locates that redoing in Esther. He understands that it's in Esther because in the Esther story, God never appears. And that's when Jews kind of stand up and say, we better take care of ourselves. And that's why that's the moment that should be our new myth. Our new myth is we have a contract with a God that wants us to step up as senior partner. And I think the question for us theologically might be, what kind of God do we believe in now? And what kind of myth story do we need to retell to ground us in that kind of God?
So first of all, I want to reinforce, I love the idea that which I hadn't seen. And by the way, I should note to our folks that you asked me last night, do I want to reread this stuff by Yitz? And I was like, no, I like to come to these texts fresh. That's the difference. I'm glad that you're doing research. By the way, like I think that both are very laudable, and I want to encourage and model that you can come to texts and just sort of read them and have an opinion. And that's not, it's good to also do research. I'm just saying that like they're all valid and folks should just feel free to read texts and think about them. But I love what, among other things, what you're saying about what Yitz Greenberg's take on this is that he's saying, he's giving another level. He's saying like, okay, we can undo this, situation where we can kind of do the wink by misquoting some TV show, whether it's the Flintstones or the Simpsons or the Seven Dwarfs. We're going to pick the one to misquote that actually has another layer of resonance here, right?
That's right.
And so you're going to say, like, why did they misquote this book rather than misquoting that book? Because we could have misquoted lots of different books and equally said it was ratified when, something happened in the book of Daniel when he came out of the lion's den. That was the ratification, whatever.
Right.
And he said, no, Esther, because Esther's the one that portrays God, or doesn't portray God directly, etc. The beyond the theological, I want to explore also the implications for the time in which we find ourselves,
Yeah.
because It's not only the COVID-19 time, although as we've discussed, that potentially there's a way to see the situation that we're now in post COVID-19 as a version of a destruction of the temple, where there is some cataclysm that we've undergone, and that we're all here now in this transitional period, which some of us, you and I included, have been saying for a long time that we are in this period without maybe the cataclysm. And so, you know, it's not just about like a matter for the next couple of months. It's maybe using what we're experiencing in the current period to sort of refocus us on, hey guys, we've been actually out here in the wilderness for a century. Let's really kind of realize where we are. But in that period, I think that what I get out of this text is where you've been saying that the rabbis, you believe that the Talmud is a message being sent forward 2,000 years from the rabbis to us, a kind of a time capsule, where they're saying to us, we experienced a destruction, a crash of the Judaism that we knew, and we responded not by trying to build another temple or
Right.
somehow figure out how to rebuild that Judaism again after the cataclysm, but rather by understanding that the time had come to build a new Judaism. And I, by the way, my take now, it happens to be that we're reading the book of Leviticus now in the Torah reading cycle, and all of a sudden I'm seeing the book of Leviticus with new eyes, because I'm seeing it also as from the perspective of the people that are hearing about all these sacrifices that you're supposed to bring, and these priests, we never knew we had priests before, you know, and all this stuff. It's like a new Judaism that's being told to these people who have just left Egypt, and God is saying, hey, there's a whole new way to be Jewish now. You thought it was
Yep.
like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and all that, but you know, no, it's all now about priests and sacrifices, and that's what was going on in the Talmud. And if we're in a position of that same kind of cataclysm now, whether the cataclysm is COVID-19 or the Enlightenment and the Emancipation or whatever it might be, that if we read a text like this and we understand that here the rabbis are saying something very bold, right, which is they're saying that even if we thought that, or we accepted the idea that God gave the Torah, even if that, then but we can find ways to say that it's not binding, and therefore we're not obligated to it, and we may say that we are with a wink, and that really tells all of us to know that maybe we'll tell the people that we're obligated to it, but really we can do a totally new thing and just call it the oral Torah. And if they are as bold as that, then I think that the message that they're sending us is, you guys, please do that to us. When the time
Yes.
comes,
Yep.
please do that to us. If we could do it to God, you can do it to us. So if we're at a time when we now have to undo the Judaism that the rabbis built, they wanted that. And that's why I'm emphasizing so much that everybody then could read it, because now that we can all read it. And another thing that Yitzhak Greenberg talks about is in the transition to this next era, that is a massively expanded creative class. And so if we can all now read it, then we should accept that we're reading it the way they read it, and that we can do this and we can be bold about it. So sorry, that was
I
a long speech,
no,
but
but
I think
I
it's really
agree.
critical.
I agree completely. And you characterized my approach much better than I do. Um, because you're precisely right. When I'm talking about reworking the tradition, I'm not talking about reworking the biblical tradition. I'm talking about reworking the tradition that they created from their reworking of the biblical and proto-rabbinic tradition. I agree completely. And this is them saying, stand on our shoulders, and here are the techniques. We did it. It'll be traditional when you do it too. And we know you're going to, yeah, we rework what we gave you. What's most traditional about our tradition is how to change it.
Right, right. And I just, you know, for those conservative voices like you talked about, the folks who, you know, look at a text and have been taught to look at a text in the most conservative reading, that is something that texts lend themselves to do. But another thing that texts lend themselves to do is the not conservative reading. And again, this, any American lawyers out there, I think, understand, if you've taken a constitutional law class, you've experienced this with the American Constitution. And if you've taken a statutory interpretation class, you've experienced this with statutory interpretation. And if you've taken any law school class, you've experienced this in a certain way, that there are all kinds of ways to look at a text. And sometimes it's looking at the words of the text and imagining that this text is trying to anchor us in a very particular view of what the law is, and we just should understand what it meant and we should interpret that way. But some texts are trying to anchor us in a certain way of thinking about the purpose of the law or the purpose of what this is all about, and to say that there's going to come a time when we don't know the examples anymore. It's too far away, and you can only imagine that 2,000 years ago, they couldn't know what was going on in our time. They knew that they couldn't know. And so if you're a responsible person writing a constitution, which I want to believe that they were and the redactors of the Torah were, that you put in there that kind of a message. And so anyone who's reading that message in there, it was put there. It's meant to
Yeah,
be there. And this is a time for us to take that seriously and ask ourselves, so what does that mean for us?
exactly. Exactly.
So yeah.
Yeah. No,
No,
you
I mean, we're out of time. So do you
okay.
want to, I mean, if you have a closing thought, I'd love to get it. And if not, we'll just say we'll be back next week.
I just want to throw out that Moshe Halbertal, who is a critical Talmud scholar today and a great Talmud scholar associated with the Hartman Institute in Israel, calls that conservative read anti-traditional.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, so that he names that what is most traditional is the willingness to radically retell the stories we received so that they work better at creating the kind of person the entire tradition was designed to create, and to add our insights into aspects of this personhood that the tradition never even glimpsed.
It's beautiful. And I think that it underscores the name of your svara, your yeshiva. You call it a traditionally radical yeshiva, and that's not meant to say that it's an oxymoron. It's meant to say that
Right.
radical is the tradition.
That's
And
right.
so I think it's a great place to stop. I just want to remind folks that we'll be back next week, not at the usual time, but instead on Tuesday at 3 Eastern, and we'll look at the story of the oven of Achnai. If you've heard it before, I still think you're probably going to get some new things from that. So that's going to be great. And then the following week, we'll be back to our usual time, which is Thursdays at noon Eastern. And we're going to be here with Professor David Kramer from the Jewish Theological Seminary, who is B'nai's original Talmud teacher. So that's going to be a amazing reunion that I can't wait to be fly on the wall for.
I'm looking forward to it. I can't wait.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for being here, and happy Passover.
Thanks so much.